something. Good morning, dear colleagues. I'm very happy to welcome you all today at our second European Regional Artificial Intelligence for Information Access conference. This event is a part of the Global AI for Information Accessibility Conference that is organized annually by the Working Group on Information Accessibility of the UNESCO Information for All program. The sixth global conference will take place on the 28th of September on Get the Town platform, and we kindly invite you to register for the event, to get acquainted with presentations of over 70 speakers, participate in live interactive session, and in the informal networking. I would like to thank the UNESCO Information for All program, the University of Osnabrück, and Mohyla School of Journalism for their support of the second European Regional AI for Information Accessibility Conference. The topic of today's event is the future of European AI. And during the first panel, we will discuss the challenges to information integrity in the age of artificial intelligence, as well as the possible ways to address them. My name is Dariia Opryshko. I'm a media law consultant and a member of the Working Group on Information Accessibility of the UNESCO Information for All program. And today, together with my colleague, Andrea Millwood Hargrave, we will moderate our event. Before we start, I would like to say a couple of words about organizational moments. We designed our event as a virtual roundtable with the possibility for the audience to ask questions. We will have a Q&A session just after the main part, that is the roundtable itself. And I would like to encourage participants to write down their questions for the speakers in the chat, so we will be able to pass them on to our panelists. I would like to open our first panel, Challenges to Information Integrity, with video remarks by Mr. Cordell Green, an Executive Director of the Broadcasting Commission of Jamaica, a Vice Chairman of UNESCO Information for All program, and a Chairman of UNESCO IFAP Working Group on Information Accessibility. Please welcome Mr. Cordell Green.
Hello and welcome. I'm pleased to join you for this satellite event, one of 9 being convened in the lead up to the 6th AI for IA conference on September 28. Gatherings like this help bring into focus a wide spectrum of perspectives: technical, ethical, cultural, legal, and social. They offer space for thoughtful exchange and creative expression, for surfacing local insights and deepening our shared understanding of artificial intelligence and its impact on our lives. I thank all participants, the local organizers, and partners for bringing this event to life. I also thank the AI for IA Planning Committee for their continued work. Your contributions are helping to build a richer, more connected conversation, one that will carry forward into the main conference. See you on the Gather Town platform on September 28th for the 6th AI for IA virtual conference.
So thank you, Mr. Green, for the warm greetings. And now let me start our discussion by focusing on today's key theme. So basically, what is information integrity? In simple words, it means ensuring that people have access to accurate, reliable, fact-based information from plural sources. Yet, in the context of a fast-changing digital environment and the rapid development of AI, this information ecosystem is constantly facing new challenges. The latter include willful malicious use of LLMs by various actors to fuel their so-called truth decay and polarization of a society, creation and mass dissemination of AI-generated images and deepfakes, just to name a few. To understand more about modern challenges to information integrity and how it is possible to address them, we will discuss technical aspects of the development and functioning of AI systems, impact of AI on society and media, as well as legal and policy measures aimed at tackling these challenges and their effectiveness with our distinguished speakers. Professor Dr. Emanuele Frontoni, who is professor in computer science with the University of Macerata and a co-director of the VRAI Laboratory. Professor Dr. Viktoriia Romaniuk, a director of Mohyla School of Journalism, deputy chief editor of StopFake.org, chair of the UNESCO IFAP Working Group on Information Ethics. Mr. Ali-Abbas Ali, director of Broadcasting Competition, Ofcom. Dr. Olga Batura, a senior scientist at the Dutch Organization for Applied Scientific Research, TNO Vector, and Professor Dr. Marco Cole, a professor for media and telecommunications law at the University of Luxembourg and director for academic affairs at the Institute of European Media Law in Saarbrücken. And I will start directly with the questions for you, Professor Frontoni. Could you please explain us the main technical aspects of how general AI functions? Are there any new recently developed techniques that are used to develop or fine-tune AI systems or models? And could these techniques, if any, influence the accuracy and reliability of content produced by unimodal AI text generators?
Thank you very much, Daria, and welcome everybody. Happy to be here with you. So I just start from here. This is my team, and I'm a nerd guy coming from computer science and working on AI from 20 years. But now, together with us, we have a lot of people coming from different disciplines that are inspiring new methods, new visions, and a different way of working with AI. And this is one of my first message. Today, AI and people working on that are no more coming from computer science. You see also from this panel this morning. And we need a lot of interdisciplinarity approach on AI, also for our technical methods. And also we need a lot of awareness. And that's why I think today we start from the technical aspects, because this is a picture, one of the picture that we generated the last year during the farmer strike in Europe. So Daria, what do you think? This is a good strike in Paris, huh?
Yeah, very modest.
This is a fake image. This is a generated image. Is designed by one of my guy using one of the model that we developed in the last years. And the funny thing is that when I get a conference in front of several farmers, one of these rise at his hands and say, "Professor, you are not able to design A bales with this AI, so we had to destroy the humanities to take the work from everyone, but we are not able to design nothing because these kind of bales here are bigger than the tractor." Okay, and that's one of the main point. We need a lot of awareness about this, and we need to ask a lot of questions about that, also on the working aspects. And this is me, with the famous design that we used in the last few months inside the GPT-4o. And this is a generated image with a huge problem of copyrights, and you will tell us a lot on that. But going back to your question, is how now is working all our story. So we started from here, from training single networks from millions of images. And this is one of the main message for me today. So we still rely on a huge amount of data, 40 million of images to recognize horses, cats, and dogs. And this is not how humans behave. My kids, the smallest one is 6, and he was not looking into 1 million cats and dogs and horses before understanding. So AI is totally different also in terms of methodology, of technical methodology from our human brains. We are totally in an opposite way. We are not doing something like humans. And you also knows that when we are going on the generative AI aspects, we usually have two different networks. One is trying to generate one content, and the other one, the discriminator, is very expert because it was trained on a huge amount of images to recognize something that is coming from humans or something that is generated by the generator. And this is the trick. All the modern methodology is based on these couple of networks. Then we can call them transformers, generative adversarial models. But you see the generator trying to generate something. And when I say trying, I say really trying because there is a random aspect, a probabilistic aspects inside every techniques that we use that is trying to generate and to make a variation of the generation. Then there is the discriminator, the guard, that is there saying, no, guys, this is not a human content, and is then deleting this output. After tens, thousands of trials, we get one nice picture like this one. And then the guard, the discriminator, leave this content pass as a human method. And this is totally true for everything that now is going on the Gen AI aspects, given that we are still very specific. So we are not inside the general AI. We are still inside the capability of doing very, very specific aspects based on data. And given that we started a huge amount of time ago, and that's why please remember that nothing is surprising now. So we know very well where we are going. We know very well what is the content of our algorithm. It's not really true that something is totally outside of the control of the people that are generating this kind of tools. And just to give you an example, this is PowerPoint, and I'm only switching on subtitles. Ora parlerò in italiano e se il sistema funziona vedrete dei sottotitoli scritti in inglese in tempo reale grazie a una grandissima evoluzione di tutto ciò che è il natural language processing che oggi abbiamo di fronte a noi. E tutto questo è fatto grazie a tanta intelligenza artificiale generativa. It's nice, eh? It's inside PowerPoint. I only have to switch on subtitles, nothing special. And everything we use here is based on a huge amount of new data, a huge amount of computational power, and very nice new algorithms. So these three things are those that changed totally the way of playing the game of AI in the last 3 years. And we really have a huge amount of computational power. Also in Europe, we are not far away from other countries. We have AI factories now going on in the European Union with a huge amount of computational power. But together with this, we also need a huge amount of data. Daria, how many of them you filled in? Clicking on traffic signs, cars, bikes, and so on.
Enormous amount, enormous.
So, and why we are doing this? You can say, okay, for understanding if I am a human or if I am a robot. So it's an anti-spam system. But in reality, this is collecting data for autonomous driving. Okay, this is a way of collecting worldwide data for autonomous driving. So we can think about that really, really in a very proper way. Not always we are doing ChatGPT or LLM or generating images, but we are doing a huge amount of nice things. And we can work on preterm infants, for example, using generative AI. We need to enlarge a little bit our vision because now we can do really a huge amount of things. Fashion, is there with a huge amount of things going on in Europe. There is a lot of made in Europe AI for fashion brands, and we can design and support the human creativity, designing new collection, and we can do a lot on that. My last point, now we are working a lot on this new methodology for privacy preserving data, copyright preserving data, and I studied machine learning for 20 years, and I never think about studying machine unlearning. And this methodology of unlearning is something that is now everywhere in our conferences. In our top conferences, we have 100 paper every conference talking about machine learning because it's too much costly to start from scratch and train again the system. So that's why now we are in front of a new set of methodologies that are also preserving privacy and copyrights. Forget my image before, because this is a totally legal image in Europe, and try to study a little bit more about this methodology. It's a nice methodology because you are adding some kind of noise to the network to try to make this network forgetting something. And this is one of the key tools today. I stop my answer here. I hope that I covered the topic, and my main message is we need a lot of awareness on the literacy of Gen AI, also to better understand where the world is going and not to trust on social media posts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Frontoni, for such a comprehensive answer. May I pass the word to Andrea?
Thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be speaking to Dr. Viktoriia Romaniuk. Dr. Romaniuk, recent research on digital news consumption published in 2025 by the Reuters Institute showed that the percentage of people consuming news from AI chatbots and via social media and video platforms is increasing, particularly among young people. As an expert in countering disinformation and manipulation, machine unlearning is quite an interesting one. Could you please define the main challenges to information integrity posed by the use of AI technologies to begin with?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your questions. Hello and welcome. I'm truly honored to join this conference and discuss some of the pressing challenges of the age of AI. I represent StopFake, a fact-checking project. This is a Ukrainian fact-checking project dedicated to analyzing the media landscape for false information and misleading information. My organization was founded in 2014. Many years before the full-scale invasion started, and for us was very important to analyze information and media landscape and analyze these different examples of misleading and false information. And our team was first in Ukraine that started to prepare some special instruments and tools to verify information professionally. In response to the panel's questions, and while analyzing the key challenges to information integrity posed by AI technology, I would like to focus on a few the main but very important aspect. First of all is hallucination and misinformation erode trust in fact living citizen uncertain about what to believe. The next, fake social media content can overwhelm authentic voices and drown out reliable information, and AI-powered disinformation campaign can target people more precisely and manipulate with a lot of languages. And of course, malicious actors could simulate grassroots participation and faking citizen feedback to influence government decisions, and it's creates some special information communication, false information communication in social media. In natural, I will start with errors, or what we call hallucination, produced by large language models. This is one of the main but most widespread problem. The well-known concept today, hallucination, is commonly used to describe situation where LLMs produce false and inaccurate answer. And here I would like to give you well-known examples. In November 2022, Meta introduced a large language model called Galactica, designed to help scientific summarize research papers and solve mathematical problem and write wiki-style articles. But after only 3 days, Meta had to remove the model for public use because it generated bias and incorrect result and incorrect information. And additional the technical error, hallucination can pose a serious reputational risk when a model generated false information about real individuals. It can spread harmful lies, damage reputation, and erode public trust in information. And of course, talking about the risk and talking about some threats, I would like to talk about the deepfake. This is another major risk, comes from AI-generated imagery. Deepfake are synthetic media that can deceptively alter a person's face, voice, and even behavior. And tools like Midjourney allow anyone to create realistic images and voices and so on. And during the war in Ukraine, we identified a huge amount of similar cases. For example, after the Trump-Zelensky Oval Office meeting, fake videos circulated on social media, and it was great cases that help us to analyze how quickly some misinformation can circulate in social media. And one video allegedly shows US President Donald Trump saying that Volodymyr Zelensky should not be taken seriously because he shop on the Chinese marketplace Temu. It was a joke, but in real, this video is a high quality deepfake created using AI. And also we have seen AI-generated video and audio where Ukrainian politicians and military officials appear to give false orders. And this is not a joke, it's absolutely serious information, but this information was prepared by AI. And studies show that 85% to attempts to generate misinformation through images generated success, and video generation is advancing rapidly, and companies like Sensation provide synthetic avatars that can speak in over 120 languages. And also OpenAI Sora models enable text to video generation during photorealistic deepfakes closer to mass production. And of course, in the context of FIMI, the principles and the technology hallucination can be intentionally exploited. This is absolutely new type of threats and problem. And here I would like to present and give 2 very, very important examples. This is one case investigated by EU Disinfo Lab and Viginum, the French government agency formerly known as Service for Vigilance and Protection Against Foreign Digital Interfere. And analysis uncovered a Russia disinformation operation called Doppelganger. The strategy involved creating fake or cloned version of legitimate media outlet, and at least 17 platforms were copied, including Bild, The Guardians, and also Ukrainian news agencies. And the goal was to trick users into visiting those fake websites where they would read false articles, watch video, and answer misleading polls, so on. And over 50 fake websites were created using a copied design and domain named resembling real ones. And some of these were deployed immediately, while others were saved for future use. And OpenAI is in its report AI and cover influence operation latest trends describe blocking 4 special clusters of account linked to actors supporting the Doppelganger campaign and Doppelganger operation, and each cluster employed a different tactic, which is typical of coordinated disinformation campaign. And in 2024, approximately 3.6 million propaganda articles infiltrate Western AI system, filling them with disinformation and manipulative content. And NewGuard tested 10 major AI chatbot, including ChatGPT, Meta AI, and Google Gemini, and so on and so on, and found of this. And finally, we see how disinformation spread within this platform. And yes, of course, all of this threat illustrated in new reality we face. AI amplifies the scale of complexity of disinformation, making it harder for both professionally and ordinary users to detect and to document. And this is the main focuses of information threats.
Thank you so much. You've actually allowed us to move very nicely into our conversation with Mr. Ali-Abbas. Ali, I think I almost don't need to ask you any questions as a result of Dr. Romaniuk's intervention. Would you like to talk a little bit about what Ofcom can do and its role within this area?
Certainly, thank you, Andrea, and thank you for the invitation. I think what I would do is split, if I may, my comments into where we are today and how we might look to the future, because I think where we are today doesn't give us a great deal of traction on these problems. At Ofcom, I should preface what I'm saying that freedom of expression guides everything that we do in our work in the information space. But within that, we have essentially 3 layers of controls that we can apply today. Very briefly, many of you will be familiar with the new Online Safety Act in the UK. That's primarily targeted at illegal content and protecting children. There is a limited set of tools around spreading false information, around foreign interference, that we can deploy for actors trying to disrupt the information space. But we anticipate that the legal threshold for applying those controls is going to be very high, and the burden of proof could be very challenging. And there's also controls around journalistic content, that it shouldn't be taken down, and there are controls around that. But in essence, the Online Safety Act has a very limited scope around information integrity. For a long time now, we have been the regulator of broadcast standards, and that is that the information that you receive on TV should be duly impartial, should be duly accurate. And under the recent Media Act in the UK, that will translate to TV-like services online under the Video on Demand Code. But as you rightly pointed out, Andrea, in your opening before Professor Romaniuk, information consumption is moving away from those sort of TV-like spaces into online spaces. So we're regulating where a large proportion of the audience is today, but increasingly the space that it is vacating, and it's going into places where we don't have regulation. And then finally, we have media ownership rules, which determine who can hold a license and give us certain controls over mergers. And that includes for newspapers, safeguarding the free expression of opinion in a newspaper. But again, it's regulation that's targeted at an old way of transmitting information. So everything that we have is either limited or essentially technologically backward looking. I think in terms of what you can do, I would just very crudely set out a value chain of production, distribution, and intermediation for how people consume information. And recognizing that's very crude, if anyone wants to get in touch separately, we've got a much more sophisticated version of this. But in that crude model, historically what we were doing is saying that at that point of distribution, we can apply controls, because you either need a broadcast license or you need a printing press. And that shaped the way that we thought about controlling and keeping a high quality of an information space. What technology has done has made the means of production very cheap. Anyone can produce content now. And it's also made distribution very cheap. And for almost no cost, you can achieve worldwide reach with your content. And that is in part what is underpinning the words of Professor Romaniuk, exacerbated by the potential for bots to massively increase the volume here. And the point of control has moved to intermediation. It's those people who manage this massive volume of information and prioritize it for you, and through the use of algorithms, try to make sense of this massive volume of information to give you the things which they think you want, most likely in service of their commercial incentives, rather than information integrity or your mental health. So just bear that in mind. And in terms of that, what do we do about it? I think, first of all, you interfere with production and distribution at your peril with regard to freedom of expression. It's permissible in most legal frameworks to tell lies as long as it's not done maliciously or with intent to cause harm. So trying to address that, I think, for individuals is a very dangerous road to go down. However, I think the question of bots and massive automation here is something which you can look at. But at that human scale, I would argue that production and distribution of content should remain largely unaffected. What you must do in that space, I think, is work on the sustainability and if you like, ongoing presence of high quality journalistic sources. How do you make sure that those sources continue to exist, they continue to thrive? How do we need to rethink historic competition constraints, for example, that we had on parties in that space, which have now been rendered obsolete by the way technology has moved? But once you've got that sustainability of high quality information, I think what becomes really important is that intermediation point. So how do you get in that world of limited attention and someone filtering that information for the audience, a degree of influence and a degree of cooperation that says what the audiences need in order for well-functioning democracies is high-quality information to penetrate. They need to be able to access those high-quality sources. Those sources need to be prominent in their news feeds and their search results. And so even in a world where you have a lot of poor quality information out there, the high-quality stuff cuts through. Very crudely, the way we talk about this is you should do what you can to deprecate bad information, but what you must do is promote good information, because the deprecation can lead you down a dark path of restricting freedom of expression, whereas promoting the good is a positive step to say that the good stuff is out there if you want to get hold of it.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. That's lots of questions, and you can already see us all coming together. And there'll be much to happen. So I'll hand back over to Dariia. Thank you very much indeed, Ali.
Yeah, thanks a lot from me as well, because your answer really very good bridges us and our conversation with the next point. In June 2024, so almost a year ago, the United Nations released global principles for information integrity. That include 5 main principles, such as societal trust and resilience, healthy incentives, public empowerment, independent and free and pluralistic media, transparency, and research. These principles are intended to serve as, let's say, a global benchmark for strengthening information ecosystems. Dr. Batura, with this framework in mind, may I ask you, are the United Nations principles of public empowerment and media pluralism reflected in the European Union's legislation such as AI Act, DSA, DMA, MFA? And do these acts truly ensure that people consistently access diverse and reliable sources of information, especially as the AI plays a greater role in how the content is delivered?
Yes, thanks, Dariia. Indeed, a very important question. So I think that indeed the legislative documents that you mentioned, so the DSA, the AI Act, the EMFA, apologies, European Media and Freedom Act, indeed provide such tools that are conducive to the realization of the UN principles of media integrity. Just to give a few examples, because obviously we don't have enough time, but just a few examples from each of the documents you mentioned. The AI Act, for example, provides for a greater transparency of specifically data used to train generative AI with systemic risk. And this is important considering that certain types of generative AI, LLMs, are nowadays used as search engines, as information sources for almost anything. You know, we just ask them and they provide an answer, and many people do not even check whether this answer is correct or not. We just heard about hallucinations from Viktoriia. Next one is DSA, which I think is one of the most important documents or legislative instruments to enhance transparency of working of platforms, in particular, of course, of the very large online platforms and online search engines, but also other types of platforms, including when these platforms use AI and even broader algorithms in general. So under the DSA, specifically Article 15, many providers, many deployers of AI face scrutiny because they have to report on content moderation and on the usage of automated means in content moderation. So, as I said, this is not just for very large platforms and search engines, it's for everyone, right? And then very large online platforms and search engines, in addition, also need to conduct risk assessment on this AI and algorithms that they use in their work. Last example from the EMFA. So EMFA is very conducive of media pluralism, I think, in that it provides for greater transparency regarding media ownership. So this introduced this instrument. However, just to follow on what Ali said about the positive kind of promotion of good content, it also contains this so-called media privilege, public media privilege. So there is an obligation to kind of push or highlight the information coming from public service broadcasters. Very important. However, one more thing that I wanted to mention, because it also falls under the principles of media integrity, is protection of journalists or kind of support of journalistic work. And EMFA also aims to consolidate the media freedom rapid response mechanism to provide practical assistance to journalists under threat and to make available an emergency support fund for investigative journalists and media organizations. Very important. I also wanted to add that besides this very kind of important acts that everybody heard of, there are also some other instruments in the EU. So for example, there is a so-called anti-SLAPP directive on the strategic lawsuits against public participation that should protect journalists against unjust prosecution. Still needs to be transposed, obviously very important to be transposed fast and consistently, but nonetheless, the instrument is there. There are also many soft law instruments, such as the Media Pluralism Monitor, in which I know our esteemed organizer, Dariia, Opryshko, participates. There are annual rule of law reports. So there are many other kind of instruments that create this base or foundation, right, for a better action at the European level, but also better action at the member state level. However, not to leave you with the impression that the EU figured it all out and we can now relax and kind of enjoy the better new world. I also want to maybe end with a bit of criticism or a bit of kind of pointing out some gaps that are left. So what we need to remember is that even if we have good legislation, and I don't say that we do, but even if we have good legislation, it needs to be implemented and applied also in a good, consistent manner. And we need to remember that in the EU, the task of implementation and application falls mainly on the shoulders of the member states. And this is often a problematic issue because of the lack of consistency, divergent interpretation, and many practical things such as lack of resources, lack of knowledge, lack of expertise at the national level. So these are all important bottlenecks. And I don't even want to mention the differences in the political will, difference in political instruments, which, by the way, also applies to the EU level, and some of the difficulties in applying even the EU law enforcing the EU law by the Commission. Another issue is the lack of competences of the EU in the field of media. As probably at least lawyers among you know, media very often falls under culture, and this is one of the weakest competences that the EU has. So culture is mainly in the hands of the member states. This forces the EU often to take the economic perspective on the problem. And while this is, of course, one of the strongest hammers that the EU has, this does not provide this holistic, comprehensive approach to the problem. Yet, even when the EU does do something or does do a lot of things, it is very often does not address kind of the root of the problem. Just as an example, one of the root causes of the spread of this undesirable, harmful content online is the business model of most platforms, which is based on attracting the most eyeballs and selling them to advertisers, also as mentioned by Ali. So because of that, certain type of content is pushed, certain algorithms are created to push this content, certain distribution mechanisms are created. By the way, this is not only in media context, but also in e-commerce context. Yeah, there are instruments that simply make us addicted to buying more things. However, this problem is not addressed by the legislation at all. Right? Instead, the practice continues, and practice creates past dependencies and habits are difficult to break, and past dependencies as well. Lastly, another big issue that I want to mention that, in theory, with all this new legislation, we have access to a lot of data, a lot of information about how platforms work, how AI functions and whatnot. However, what to do with all this wealth, right? How to draw conclusions, how to base good, sustainable decisions on this data and on this information. I'm not sure that us drowning basically now in this data, or regulators drowning, policymakers drowning in this data is helpful in any way. So kind of, the ball is now maybe in slightly different way in the on the field of the regulators, and there is also maybe a blind spot that I want to mention, that there is still diminished regulatory scrutiny of platforms that are SMEs. All we're talking about are large platforms. SMEs are very often excluded from them. So I'll just stop here, because I know Professor Cole is speaking after me, and he possibly has a longer list with potential deficiencies and gaps to be addressed. So thank you very much for this discussion.
Thank you, Olga, for your valuable insights, and you're absolutely correct. My next question is to Professor Cole. If we look further in the European Union's legislation, right, I'd like to invite you to reflect on it through the prism of two other United Nations principles, that is healthy incentives and transparency and research. And here I have two questions. The first is the DSA that we've mentioned right now. It requires very large online platforms to conduct risk assessment and publish transparency reports. But do these reports go far enough to meet this UN transparency principle, particularly given that AI systems are really shaping information visibility? And I will ask the second question right now, just not to interrupt you in answering. The second question is connected with AI Act. The AI Act introduces obligations for high-risk systems. Should AI systems that shape news distribution or content moderation be classified as the high risk, given their societal impact on information integrity? The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Dariia, to you and also Andrea for putting together this panel, but also for putting this nice order together. So I will actually pick up the ball that Olga has played into my field, and it's good maybe that for some issues you will hear something that you already heard, because one of the problems I have in discussing at AI conferences, policy measures, legal elements is you cannot wake up a day with not having 15 new impressions and the speed at which this happens. So actually, if we align and have certain similar observations, it can already help, because normally what happens is you go out of a conference with another 15 new ideas or problems or challenges and risks, and it must be an unbelievable, really an unbelievable demand that legislators have today to react in the right balance to this. And also the two questions that you're posing, I will answer them separately, but it allows me to merge a little bit my viewpoints. So one of the issues that with your first question you put forward quite bluntly is actually, is the DSA sufficient? Is the DSA doing enough? Are the intermediaries, which we categorize as very large online platforms, and we should say, I know that you know this and everyone has already talked about it, but I would like to underline it. It's not only VLOPs, it's also VLOSIs, so the very large online search engines. And what we just heard about the change in search attitude since we have the AI summaries, we can be lucky that the DSA was designed, that it was reformulated to explicitly say also search engines. Okay, so already that was a very smart step, if you ask me, that the legislator considered. Attention, there is a difference between online platforms and search engines, but at the end of the day, their impact will be similar. No one, when they wrote that a few years ago, had an idea how in half a year the click results for news sites would go down dramatically because of only these few lines of summary at the beginning. And that maybe is a completely new legal issue that we have to discuss with, which goes well beyond transparency that you asked me about. So the essence of your question is DSA doing enough? And one of the problems to answer that question is we can't really know yet, can we? So Ali very impressively has talked about the Online Safety Act, but even there, we can't yet really know whether it is enough and how far it goes. This is the tragedy of today's times, and I mean this serious, because we've had that always, that law has to follow up on technical developments and we have to apply it and then we have to see how it works out and we have to balance things. But just consider, if you look at DSA and also AI even more together, on how much, I call it secondary legislation, is following up the main text. And then we are still not talking about the application, the enforcement, and all of this in a span of a few years, which is not very long, considering, we've got a very complex multi-level system with the EU and 27 member states and different enforcement institutions that we just heard about. This is fast, but it's much too slow in a way. So can I answer the question whether the DSA is going far enough by putting risk assessments in and obliging VLOPs and VLOSIs to publish transparency reports? My answer to that would be, hopefully we will at least keep that standard that we have now. And hopefully, and Olga went on about that very much, hopefully it will actually be applied in practice. Because now let's speak it out even more bluntly than Olga did. In these times, we have to fear that whether we think it is sufficient or not, the level we have reached with the DSA, or also in the UK with the OSA, I mean, visiting royals in their chambers may help for a few days or weeks, but I'm not sure whether it will be a permanent safety guard rail against potential pressure in terms of tariffs and so on when it comes to tech regulation. Because if they would read the OSA, they would realize the OSA is more than the DSA. But just really, truly, the pressure from both Asia and the US in terms of the question of how to apply DSA rather puts the answer in saying we should make sure that the DSA's transparency principle, that the DSA's risk assessment obligations are taken serious, are enforced to the extent that we can enforce them. And then maybe in 5 years, we can say, is it really sufficient in view of how strong AI systems shape information visibility? I know this is not a very satisfactory answer, but I really fear that if we would respond to the issue by saying we put another layer of regulation on top, that would not be a guarantee that things go right, because we don't even know whether this risk assessment works. Another point is the DSA is a lot more than only risk assessment and transparency reports when it comes to information integrity, if you ask me. We have in there also the risk mitigation, right? It's not only the risk assessment. If VLOPSIs come to the conclusion that they are posing a risk, then they have to mitigate these risks. And that, for me, one of the first areas to look at, for example, also for search engines when it comes to the AI summaries, is that maybe risking of blurring information integrity because people don't go anymore to the sources, they don't check, we don't check, it's just this automated generated summary. So don't forget that the assessment is the first step, the mitigation is the second. Now again, what happens if they don't mitigate? It's up to enforcement. What does that mean? Olga mentioned potential fragmentation of enforcement in Europe due to the fact that the member states are in charge. Well, for this one area, and I'm not a friend of it, I want to say, but for this one area, the European Commission said, we'll deal with it because we need a one-stop shop. Okay, let's see how good that can function. We have quite a brave attempt, if you ask me, both against Chinese based VLOPs as well as US. Maybe it was pure coincidence of history, but they took as one of their first conflict zones a platform whose owner happens to have, at least at the beginning of the new US administration, had a very close relationship to the administration. So I don't even want to know what would have happened if the Commission would have concluded the X inquiry a year earlier and would have combined it with a huge fine. I don't want to imagine if that would have happened in February and Musk would have still been the head of Doge, whether he would have just went to the office next door and said, Donald, we need to do, I'm sorry, I'm being very, very unprecise, okay? Forgive me as a lawyer, but I think this is also a policy circle that we can discuss is what would have happened if he would have said we have to do something against this DSA in Europe, okay? So that just as a first point. There is enough in the DSA, I would say, to start. There is one last point in that first question I would like to make, and that is, it's interesting that the UN Global Principles for Information Integrity, which you mentioned in your question, and also which are the underlying issue why we're discussing this here today, put transparency together with research, right? That's interesting. And why is that interesting? Because we are all learning. Look at today. Look at what we learned from Emanuele's input right through to all the other speakers. We are learning. We have to learn at a very high speed. We are trying to understand. We can't even understand a lot of things that are happening. The institutions which have been working very prudently and also traditionally over decades, see Ofcom, suddenly have to completely change their role. They have to take on board competencies. They have to deal with actors which were not their usual clients. Okay, it was the BBC and it was ITV, and now suddenly, who are you talking to when you look at the OSA? Again, very steep curve. So it is true that transparency will only help if both public authorities, so forgive that I put Ofcom or all the media regulators as public authorities. We should maybe be a bit more precise and say, yeah, they're public authorities, but of their own kind because they're independent and so on. Dariia and we could have a long conversation about independence of media regulators, but that I take that as a given. You know what I mean? So state authorities as well as researchers will need the transparency. Why do I say that? Individuals are just completely overwhelmed. And is it really going to make a change that an individual can read in a transparency report of one of the VLOPSs how they have introduced content moderation systems or how they changed it? No, it'll have to be research. It'll have to be NGOs, which I would include under research. They can make a difference together with public enforcement. So yes, transparency, very important, but together with research. And that is an issue. I'm not an expert in that field, but from what I gather, and I don't know whether Emanuele and the computer science people would share this, but from what I gather is it's becoming not easier to access data. With the entry into force of the DSA, it's maybe due to the competitive development and the fact that the AI actors now are on the scene and the old intermediaries suddenly have to push to keep their space in the market, it's becoming more difficult for researchers to access meaningful data. That is something where maybe, because it concerns the whole industrial sector, enforcement can go a first step and say, this is meant serious. Vetted researchers, this needs to be done. And well, obviously also it needs to be financed, that research, so that is a completely different element. Finally, on that first element, the second one will be shorter. I can only subscribe to what Olga said and also the way you posed the question to her. This whole thing happens in an environment of legislation, okay? The DSA doesn't stand singular. When we talk about the impact that AI systems have on shaping information visibility, we have to talk about the sustainability of what we would call reliable, trustworthy media. And then we are in the middle of questions like findability, prominence of, for example, public service media content. We're talking about visibility of content on platforms. So then the question is, would the DSA be the right place for that? And my answer would be no. I think, don't forget, we've got the Audiovisual Media Services Directive of the EU, which might be reformed, and there is a findability provision in there. We've got the European Media Freedom Act that deals with the relation between media and very large online platforms, maybe not to a very extensive amount, but it's there. And I wouldn't say that it is only negative that the member states have the cultural policy still in their hands, because we are living in a time where we will also have a competition of good solutions. And the more we centralize on the EDU, it's a win or fail. If we have different approaches from different member states, and I very, very much regret for many reasons that the EU is not part of, that the UK is not part of this game, at least not directly, really. I mean, it's serious, because the Ofcom in the decades when the UK was part of the EU was a very, very good driver of innovation. And we're missing, if I may say so, the Ofcom at the table of the EU regulators. But certainly we need that competition of good solutions up to a certain extent, although I understand that it's easier to talk to Meta as one and not as 27. Okay, short on the second question. Should the AI Act in high-risk systems be extended to whenever it's used in the content of news distribution or content moderation? One issue of the AI Act, and again, I don't want to say it negative, at least we have the AI Act. I don't even know whether if we would start today trying to legislate, whether we would get an AI Act within the next 1 or 2 years. It's there now, but it is a product safety-oriented risk regulation, so to speak. And it's not specific for news. And if we would be too harsh in a way, the news providers themselves are trying to use AI in order to make their voice better heard. So maybe we would implement new obligations on them as well, which would make it again more difficult for them to survive in this really difficult environment. So would they be the right addressee of a high-risk obligation, which is quite extensive in the AI Act? Could we separate the AI system from the news providers? I am not so sure. On the other hand, Dariia, you're rightly asking that question, because we're not allowed to forget plurality of the media landscape, access to reliable information, at least in the understanding of the Court of Human Rights under the European Convention on Human Rights, is an obligation of states. They are the ultimate guarantors of media pluralism. So if they realize that the use of AI systems completely distorts the news media landscape, I think they have to act. There is a duty to act. And maybe then it goes in the direction that you are saying. So states cannot stand by and just watch this. There is a fundamental rights component to this, which is very important. One of the issues about the Framework Convention of the Council of Europe, once it is applicable or enters into force, is that it only applies to public directly, but all the ratifying states are invited to extend it to privates. And hopefully many will do that, because then that is also a good sign to say this has a fundamental rights basis. And for us, Article 10, freedom of speech, freedom of the media, obviously is the anchor to do that. But again, I don't think just categorizing as high risk would be enough. It is important that users understand what is happening with AI in the news dissemination system. So media literacy in a very broadly understood sense is probably more key than whether or not we can upgrade the use of AI systems to make them high risk. On the other hand, even if they're not high risk, we have Article 50, which applies to all AI systems, the transparency obligation, which says if AI systems are intended to interact directly with natural persons, then they have to be informed about it. That information is not yet, I think, very visible and very clear. Even again, the summary at the beginning, yes, it does say somewhere there is a symbol of AI-generated summary, but I'm not sure whether that is already clear enough. We do have a provision on deepfake in Article 50. We have it. It says that when you use deepfakes, you are supposed to make that visible. Now, obviously, the rogue actors or the bad actors will not do that, but let's start about what we have. And Article 50, which applies to everyone and not only high-risk systems, is there. Let's try and see whether that cannot help. But to look forward a little bit and to pick up your idea, if we read not the category of high-risk systems, but the category of prohibited practices. I will just briefly quote. Article 5 says the following AI practices shall be prohibited. Placing on the market and so on, we know, of AI systems that deploys subliminal techniques beyond a person's consciousness or purposefully manipulative or deceptive techniques. Just read that slowly, listen slowly to it, and maybe we are getting much closer to that category when we talk about a combination of deepfake, disinformation campaign, trying to undermine democratically functioning systems. So yes, it is attractive to think about where do we have to place AI systems that have an impact on news dissemination. So I will not say the direct answer is yes, they should be categorized as high-risk systems, but maybe we have to talk about looking at all of it. Minimum, they are AI systems transparency, maybe high risk, but maybe even prohibited practices. When I say this, we're at a time where we're not discussing the upscaling or adding of further EU legislation. We are actually discussing the dismantling, right? We are discussing the question of whether the AI Act went too far, whether the AI Act is stifling innovation and killing EU versus the rest of the world. So let's not push too much in the direction of changing things now, because what we will get if we open the AI Act is rather, it will be a minimization, it will be a reduction of the rules that are already in place, if you ask me. The only area where I see an easy solution, it's not an easy solution, but that may be happening is, why do we not consider media? And then the big question, and that's why it's not easy, is what media as critical infrastructure? I think that is one thing we have to acknowledge, and it's been mentioned in some of, not explicitly, but in some of the contributions now. I think we have to understand or decide whether media in the traditional sense are a critical infrastructure for democracy, as much as is energy and so on. And if that's the case, then that is maybe the place where we come in with funding, with supportive measures, with protection, think of cybersecurity, but also via the AI Act, Annex 3, then we might get there because we have a provision about critical infrastructures there, which then could be categorized as high-risk systems. I hope I didn't go into too much detail, but you realize I do not have the perfect answer yet, but I'm thinking in all different directions, and your questions have been giving a good food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot. Really fascinating answer, really comprehensive. And yes, actually, that's a good point. The last one, if we should consider media as a critical infrastructure. And here it will be the question how to distinguish a real media that acts according to the standards and so on and so forth, with let's say medium that disseminates propaganda and so on. So here we really have a difficult question in this sense, but I think it would be the topic for another panel or for another conference. Listening to your answer, I actually had a question to Emanuele, because probably you are listening to us speaking about these legal norms, about the DSA, DMA, AI Act, the UK legislation, and so on and so forth. But actually, for me, let's say, and I think for many of us, there is a question of what is technically possible, right? What is really, because we can think about a lot of provisions, we can think about a lot of legal remedies trying to address, but what can we do in practice? How can we really tackle this problem? For instance, the problem of such information operations like doppelganger, or another type of operation, the Pravda network, when around 200 minimum specially created in internet domains were created to pollute the LLM and the results that were given by LLMs. So what can we basically technically really do to tackle this problem?
So first of all, thank you very much for this again, interdisciplinarity here. I really like the idea of Mark on working on media as critical infrastructure because we really need something different on what we are doing up today. On the research and on the technical side, I'm quite optimistic. So research is going very fast on having small models, on having a learning approach, on having explainability. You saw very quickly before my picture on the preterm infants, where you have a lot of explainability by example for the clinicians, because it's not only something about AI act or high risk application, but it's also something about the trust. So no one will trust us if we are not trust six sense on that of the system. And also we have now a very great experience on access to data on synthetic data. We are designing one of the biggest experience in Europe for diabetic cares and for risk prediction in diabetic cares that is totally based on synthetic data and is showing a great performance on real data. It's one of the best paper that we released in the last 3 months. And again, this is not a new area of research, but is an area that is moving very fast. So on the technical side of the moon, let's say that your inputs are very useful. No one on the computer science aspect will never had worked on synthetic data or on learning or explainability by example without your inputs. So what I bring back to my lab today is a lot of ideas, mainly for medias. We are now in the middle of elections here in Europe, and the other point for me is the something like the content credentials. Probably we need to work a lot on that because we can. Up to now, Adobe is putting a content credential everywhere in every software solution. And if we have some methodology to mark artificially designed images with content credential based on blockchain, so not easy to remove or to falsify or to I think that this can be another European approach that can differentiate a lot our country, our Europe from other way of thinking about AI. And content credentials are there. If you create an image with Firefly and then you put your image on PowerPoint, you will see appearing the content credential logo with all the information about the images. But we need to force also media not only as critical infrastructure, but also as a de facto standard for media producers to have a text based on content credential, images based on content credential, and videos based on content credential. If we will be able to design a solution that is doing that, that is also part of the transparency of the algorithm that is generating this kind of contents, I think that we will reach a very nice solution. So that's my idea. I'm quite optimistic that we will be there in 12 months from the research side. Then the big point is the adoption, because we can have a very nice paper published on a nice journal, but then no one is reading our technical journal. So we need a lot of work for making this adoption in the media companies and around also the smallest companies, the small and medium enterprise that are working on social media content creation, that are producing manual, technical manual, and so on. So apart from research, adoption is still a big point. I hope I give you an answer, Dariia.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And we have a question from our audience. The question to Mark Cole. Would you be able to elaborate on what tools the European Union already has available in terms of existing legislation to protect, for instance, financially and editorially, promote quality media if we were to start the public media, for instance? Or what could be, let's say, easy legislative tools to adopt?
Well, thank you very much. Actually, it's a question that also Olga could answer very well as well. Maybe, Olga, if it's okay, I'll start with a few comments and then you can follow up if I'm not comprehensive. So, as Olga indicated, or Dariia also in the question to Olga, the European Media Freedom Act is again another one piece of legislation which it may sound as if I'm being repetitive, but it just shows the unbelievable speed in which the previous commission laid legislative proposals on the desk, and also Parliament and Council followed suit and actually passed them. But also the European Media Freedom Act entered into force last year, but only became applicable, at least for the majority elements, on the 8th of August. So indeed, a few weeks ago, and there's still some bits will only start in 2027. The European Media Freedom Act is the first step in that direction. And it's exactly the dilemma that it's trying to resolve, the dilemma that Olga explained to us. And that is, normally the European Media Freedom Act should not exist as an EU piece of legislation. I'm being a bit too critical, but what I mean is it actually falls very much into the cultural competence of the member states. And that's the reason why it didn't exist previous. The Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which if you want is a predecessor, but only very specific for the market of audiovisual media services, could be created because of the link to the in the satellite technology that came up in the 1980s, basically, and made it possible to disseminate your content easily across borders. And different than with a cable, you couldn't actually switch it off. Cable you can stop at the border. A satellite dissemination you would have to distort if you don't want the signal to be received in your member state. And that was the entering point for the idea of a European market for television services originally. So that was easy to argue why, and rightly so, that the EU regulated. It was very hesitant to extend that to press, radio, or any other services, because they by definition were either not so heavily regulated nationally, press, or radio. There was a lack of this cross-border dimension, mainly because of the size of markets and so on. Now, the European Media Freedom Act, after a lot of resistance, tries to address that. Says, okay, we use the market harmonization competence, which is maybe a little bit far-fetched if you consider that what it is actually about is cultural policy and promoting news media. But what it does, and that is good, is opens up the acknowledgement that certain basic rules should apply to all types of media, irrespective what they are. It doesn't even categorize anymore in terms of press and television and so on. It's just media, although there are some definitions which are not yet really ripe, but okay. And it differentiates between media and news media. And I think that is the main step forward. There is a specific category which has higher obligations, but also should have a higher level of protection. And I am against saying, well, certain types of media, yellow press, are not useful. No, but we have to acknowledge, and that answers also a little bit your question, Dariia, we're not there yet, but we have to acknowledge there are different types of media. And one type of media is contributing to the democratic opinion making. And there should be a special bowl or a field in which they play, both with obligations and with rights. And what is in there? There is obligations on editorial independence. There are rules on protecting journalists against, for example, encroachment both by states, intrusive software and so on, but also by decision making by editors. So that could be very interesting in the times where we see a higher media concentration happening cross-border, also in the television market, by the way. They have accompanying legislation, or at least recommendations on the safety of journalists. And there is, but to a very limited extent, funding available for cross-border European media projects. Why very limited? Because that is the last area where you can clearly say the EU definitely doesn't have the competence to lay out, for example, a public service media funding pot. That would be very difficult. But the European Media Freedom Act does, for the first time, address specifically certain guarantees for public service media, which are addressed to the member states, meaning the member states have to make sure that their national legislation, for example, includes provisions on how to safeguard the independence of the leading management of public service media. It's there. Why is it not yet ripe to say it's enough? Because it only just became applicable on the 8th of August this year, and we will have to wait and see what the Commission does. So yes, it is possible. For the moment, I don't think we need to add anything more, but we should see how the EMFA plays a role in the next 2 to 5 years. Olga, is that sufficient?
Comprehensive, Mark. Thank you so much. I just wanted to add maybe that obviously there are other things that can be done if we have enough political will, let me put it this way. So, for instance, it has been discussed, at least in the academic circles, that to guarantee media independence and including the funding of media, certain instruments of the European competition law could be used, specifically also rules on state aid and so many things. This was discussed by some academics in the context of the situation in Hungary and the lack of independence of Hungarian public service broadcasters. Some people think, I belong to them, that these instruments could be and should have been used. However, the Commission did not do it. So we just state it as a fact and leave it aside, because obviously the legal assessments differ, and we don't know all the information that was available to the Commission probably at that time. However, indeed, other instruments kind of beyond this specially created media regulation, emerging media regulation, we should say, could be used. And also, I also mentioned that with the EMFA, just to conclude with what Mark said, there is this certain media privilege in Article 18, if I'm not mistaken. They changed the numbering, right? So that kind of large platforms should highlight, should promote the information, the content coming from public service broadcasters. So this is one of these positive measures that Ali mentioned earlier in the context of the UK. So these are just as examples. Probably, if we think a little bit longer, we can also find other legislative instruments. There are also tons of soft law instruments, tons of different recommendations, European Parliament's resolutions, Council recommendations, and beyond the EU, there is obviously the Council of Europe that also constantly work on these issues. We will need probably another 2 hours to discuss all that is done there. Yeah, sorry, I just stop here because probably we have other questions.
No, it's fine. Thank you very much. I think that it's time to wrap up our panel, and I would like to pass the floor to Andrea.
Thank you very much. It's there are many questions I'm sure the panel would have liked to have asked of each other. So thank you very much for addressing each other as well. I've been asked to sum up. I'll start by saying there will be a report prepared. So please forgive us, and me particularly, if we've left anything out in this very short summary. I think the first and most important thing I've taken away from it, which we all know, but everybody had mentioned, is that there are many changes in both the way news is consumed, both in terms of its environment and speed, and also where the points of distribution are. And towards the end, we started, Mark Cole, I think, first mentioned it, talked about the word democracy. And I think that's why we think this is a very important area in Europe. And as Dariia knows, I say also in the UK, because I too wish we had never left. But anyway, not to go there. I think one of the most interesting things to me was the very start, because I'm not a scientist, Emanuele, was where you started off by talking about the different computational skills of humans and AI. And I think that's something that's very easy for us to forget. And aligned with that is the issue of literacy, because our computational skills may be different and we may be more advanced, but we also need to understand better what has been done to data and information that we're given. So I think interdisciplinary work that was talked about and has been covered within this panel very well is very important. And it's not just in terms of development, but also in terms of regulation and policy. There were many, many examples given. Transparency was talked about a lot. Public authorities, researchers all need information. But then you also have business and economic practices, and we haven't talked possibly enough about that. I know SMEs were mentioned, but they were mentioned in passing. The examples of the negatives that Viktoriia gave and the dangers to democracy, I think are so important. And again, we're talking about news, we're talking about journalism, we're talking about fundamental structures for our democracy. So I think that's another very important takeaway, which we all know, but it's always worth emphasizing. There was talk about a desire for high quality journalism, and indeed the research, the Reuters research talks about that. Also, the research that was published yesterday by the Tony Blair Institute in the UK talked about a desire for high quality journalism. I think it was Olga talked about the EMFA fund for journalists. Within all that, there is an understanding in the Tony Blair work, certainly they talked about ethical standards, and certainly even young people, dare she say that, wanted good data, and they wanted to be able to know how to verify. And we didn't get to talk about about content moderation, which I know Dariia and I had hoped we might get to. But verification methods, I think, are very important. And people are using social media and therefore echo chambers to verify the information that they're getting. I will close, I promise, Dariia, in a moment, but I think machine unlearning as a positive rather than just negatives was quite an interesting area, in privacy and copyright. Well, the particular areas you talked about, and I'd love to learn more about that. And maybe, Emanuele, if you have more data, you can pass it to us so that we can share it amongst ourselves. I think that is a very important area. It goes along with verification. It goes along with content moderation. And then somebody talked about, I think it was Mark Cole, talked about the competition for good solutions. Well, what a good idea that would be. I'd put down again machine unlearning, content credentials were talked about, trust, transparency, media literacy. These are all very important areas that should be talked about. And going back to trust and freedom of expression, those were two areas that came up again and again. Freedom of expression shouldn't be forgotten. And if we are thinking about media as a critical infrastructure to our democracies, of course, that's crucially important. I need to thank everybody on behalf of Dariia and myself. I need to thank Dariia, who has done an exceptional job. We do, of course, have to thank our colleagues in the IFAP programme, and there will be a report. Please join us on Sunday, the 28th of September on Gathertown, where we will be launching. I know it's a Sunday. We all know it's a Sunday. We'll be launching the full conference. But importantly, the data will be there. The various videos that we have will be there for you to view after that time. So please do try and find out a little bit about it, or ask Dariia or myself. And thank you all very much indeed. It's been really, really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you a lot from myself. And with this, we are closing our first panel, and looking forward to see you next time. Thank you. Have a good day and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.